Hey everybody, happy Thursday morning. This is another edition of the Podcast Daily. I'm Bill Landis. That is Austin Ward, and we are very pleased to be joined by Scott Dochterman from The Athletic. Scott not only endures covering the Iowa Hawkeyes, but he also is a former coworker of Austin and I, so he's a real trooper for that as well. We appreciate it. Scott, how you doing?
I'm doing great, guys. It's good to see you both. The podcast looks great, and happy to talk to you, although I don't really have a lot of good things to say about the team I cover right now.
Or the place where we work together, so we don't have to talk about that. We do have to talk about
we can skip that
talk
one.
about the Hawkeyes, though.
Scott, it's been a minute since you've had to come to Columbus to cover a game. Do you remember where everything is and how Ohio Stadium's situated?
A little bit, just because of covering basketball. That's the only reason. I did cover home and away. I covered Iowa basketball for 8 years, so I did get to see the Schottenstein Center several times.
Real beauty.
One time I remember taking a cab to make sure I got to the Outback Bowl in time, and that was something else. But no, it's been 9 years since football in Columbus, which just, if you think about it, over the span of the geographic divisions, Ohio State clearly is number one, but Iowa was number 3 in wins in the Big Ten, and they've played Ohio State once over that span, and not even at the Death Star. So I just think of it as the Big Ten really missed an opportunity. I think there were a few years there where maybe, I don't know how competitive it would have been, but it would have been compelling if nothing else. And so it's really a shame that it's gone this long without seeing each other, because you wonder, God, are you in the same league anymore? It's been that
Scott,
long.
I didn't even believe it. Somehow in my mind, I had tricked myself into thinking that Ohio State and Iowa had played again since the 2017 beatdown on the Buckeyes there in Iowa City. It just doesn't compute in my brain. There's no way, because I remember Iowa being here, and that had to be afterwards, because there's no way that teams like this should have to go 5 years without seeing each other. And I know that they were supposed to before, but I don't. It's only going to get worse if you get to 16 and potentially beyond. I know we'll maybe talk to you about future schedules and your expertise there later on, but it's just it doesn't seem right. That shouldn't be how conferences work.
Yeah, that's part of this problem. I mean, it's funny. I went through it 4 different times. These games have been canceled since Nebraska joined the league. I mean, in 2009 and 2010, there were 2 fantastic games. The Buckeyes won in overtime in the last de facto Big Ten championship game, and then in 2010, Terrell Pryor, had a 4th and 10 run and beat Iowa and Iowa City by 3. Since then, they were supposed to play in 11 and 12. That got canceled when you went to divisions. They were supposed to play in 14, but then Maryland and Rutgers showed up. And then in 2020, the COVID year, which kind of screwed everything up. And that would have been a very interesting game, because by the end of the year, Iowa was in a really good spot. They'd won 6 straight, all of them by at least 14 points. Their point differential was really high, and their defense was probably as good as it's been in the last 2 decades. So I think that would have been a really interesting game, whether it would have been in Columbus like it was supposed to, or even in Indianapolis, but it didn't happen. And that's really just unfortunate, because again, this Saturday is just not even close to being an even matchup. But had they had a few of those, I think we would have saw some really compelling television for a lot of people, and then just making the league a lot stronger.
I think the one thing that is interesting is Ohio State's offense against Iowa's defense, or potentially interesting. But before I ask you about that, Scott, I want to ask you this. Does Iowa's offense have any redeeming qualities?
None. I mean it. I'm going to be truthful here. In the past, even when they've had bad offenses, and they've had a lot of them, believe me, I've watched them all. But the problem with this one is they don't have anything they can lean on. They have a very young offensive line that's taking a while to gel. Their most veterans are 2 sophomores who played as freshmen. The rest, in fact, they started 3 sophomores and 2 freshmen, I think, against Illinois. They do have good tight ends. I'll give them that. The receivers are work in progress. They only had 1 scholarship receiver available for the first 2 games. And the running backs are coming along. They're all right. And Spencer Petras is bottom half of the Big Ten and as a quarterback. So they can't lean on the running game like they normally would. At least they can have a puncher's chance there. Nothing there. And the passing game is just way too inconsistent. So even if the defense, which is a good defense, it may not look like it on Saturday, but even if the defense kept them in the game, the offense isn't going to be able to catch up. And that's really the shame of this matchup because, what we've seen in the past, like I'll go back to the last time Iowa was in Ohio State in 2013. There was a disparity there in talent, no question. Braxton Miller danced circles around the Iowa defense. But the difference was that Iowa lined up with 3 tight ends. They had Brandon Sheriff. They had some really good players. George Kittle was their 3rd tight end. And they decided, you know what, this is our best chance. And they just went power. And it took Ohio State about a half to catch up just to the physicality. And then the talent took over and they won by 10. They just don't have that this year. And that's a shame because this defense is going to look really bad probably on Saturday. And it isn't
Scott,
that
I
bad.
can't believe that Bill didn't use any references to upside or downside with that question about the Iowa offense. What a cop-out from Bill.
I don't want to be mean.
That question,
I don't want
though,
to beat them while they're down.
We're going to talk a lot about how good Iowa's defense is, I promise. But that question, in the way, like everybody wants to know what the hell is going on with Brian Ferentz and, the quarterback situation. And one of the great things about covering college football, I think, from the last couple of years has been finding out stuff like how COVID policies work and schedule arrangements and NIL deals. And now, like Iowa nepotism laws, like that's got to be a real treat for you.
Yeah, I learned about it firsthand in 2012 when he came aboard as the offensive line coach, which is where he really should be because he is a very good offensive line coach, and that's where they could use the most help. That's been the most disappointing part of this. But, since 2017, he's been the offensive coordinator. They've had some good moments. I mean, think about the last time they played Ohio State. That was a well-coached game. The problem is everything went bad at the same time. And the worst part of it for Iowa fans is it was entirely predictable. Last year, they were bottom 10% in the country in offense. But there's this nifty new thing that everybody else uses that Iowa doesn't called the transfer portal. And quarterback, it's an issue. Well, let's look at it. Well, we're fine where we are. Offensive line, hey, why not? Why can't you bring in a couple of guys that would say, look, Iowa sends a lot of offensive linemen to the NFL. Come here and improve. Didn't do any of that. Wide receiver. No, we're good there until your best one leaves and now is an All-American. And so all of that kind of unfolded. And then their quarterback coach, a longtime consigliere, Ken O'Keefe, retires in the offseason, and then they moved Brian Ferentz to quarterbacks coach. He was an offensive lineman, for God's sakes, at Iowa, a center, and that hasn't really worked out. And that's really what sent everybody over the top because they wanted a new scheme because this scheme is the same one they used 20 years ago. And so you have the confluence of all those things, and they're young, and then all these injuries happen, freak injuries in camp, and here they are. So that's the problem with Iowa. I think if you want to talk upside, yes, I think next year the offensive line will probably be pretty good, but they're going to have to start investing in the transfer portal because if you want to maintain your positioning in college football, which Iowa traditionally, I think you could say it's somewhere between 35 and 15. Depending on the year, that they could be they've won 10 games twice out of the last 4 years, or be on the edge of the top 25. I think that's fair, but you're going to have to go in the transfer portal this year to get a quarterback. They're just, unless Spencer Petras comes back for year 6. And if that happens, I don't know if there'll be any fans of Kinnick next year.
It's interesting to me, Scott, that Iowa's been sort of so set in its ways on offense when, correct me if I'm wrong, they actually did change things up a little bit on defense, at least from the last time Ohio State fans have watched them. They're like more of a 4-2-5 now, right? Just kind of a more modern defense that's built for spread offenses. Like what, I guess, talk a little bit about that, but then also just what makes this Iowa defense tick, because I think people are wondering if this can actually be a good challenge for Ohio State.
It is interesting because in 2018, what happened was they got beat by a slot receiver a couple of times down the field, and then ultimately for the game-winning touchdown against Wisconsin. And Phil Parker had been kind of looking at this and massaging it, but Iowa had been traditionally a 4-3, and he's like, look, everybody runs 3 receiver sets. We're going to have to match up better. And they have been even a better defense, and they've been pretty good before that since they went to the 4-2-5. And they've had, I think, 3 guys or something like that who've been the defensive backs of the year in the Big Ten. So they've been able to match up better. And one of the things they do so well is they're largely a half a defense or cover 2 / cover 4-4. And they also they really try to avoid giving up big plays in the back end. And they rush 4, and they never go 8 in the box. So that most of their guys, especially in the interior, play 2 gap most of the time, and they do it so well, and they're so unselfish that it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to bring a safety down. And they've been able to stop the run that way. And so then they can play, the back 4, in pretty good coverage, and then 5, really with their cash back. And so they're in the right position. Phil Parker is a stickler when it comes to geometry of the field, where you need to be. If the ball's on this hash and you're playing this, you need to be right here every single time. And the only time they've really been tested on the back end and hurt for it is usually Purdue. And I think that could give you a little bit of a glimpse to what Ohio State can do, because they would repeatedly attack down the field and they would make Iowa play every blade of grass. And even though they've got some talent back there, it's tough for them to do that. So the only way that they can mitigate that is apply pressure up front. And they've got one really good pass rusher, but he's a sophomore. He's probably about a year away from being that elite level player. And at the second level, they've got a great player in Jack Campbell, but they're just I don't know that they can get consistent pressure on Ohio State. And I think the problem is with, 2 of the best receivers in the country. And I don't know if number 3, if he's going to be back or not, because he automatically leaps to the top of the list. And if that happens, then that's going to be a lot of pressure on a unit that's really good, really disciplined, excellent on-ball defenders, but for an entire game, and especially if their offense is having a lot of 3 and outs, which I expect, that's going to be a lot for them to try to
Scott,
keep up
that was
with.
really what I was wondering, because it doesn't seem like Ohio State expects Iowa to bring a ton of pressure or exotic looks at them. That the Hawkeyes seem like they feel like those front 4 guys, if they can get the pressure, that'd be their best chance of winning the game, and that they feel pretty good about that. Have there been opportunities for Iowa where they that's not going to work, we're going to have to blitz this guy? And if that happens, I don't feel like that's a great matchup for anybody against CJ Stroud. But how flexible are they when it comes to getting aggressive to try and account for that if they can't win matchups against Paris Johnson or DeJuan Jones?
They actually do that. And I said it before that the offense could learn from the defense with this, because they do shake things up. And this is part of it, where Jack Campbell is an outstanding blitzer. He's 6'5", 250, mostly blitzes from the interior because their preference with him is get somebody that big, that long, that athletic in the quarterback's face, as opposed to off the edge, which I think he'd be a really good edge defender if he wanted to do that too. They do blitz occasionally from, either the weak side or the strong side, just depending on the alignment to go along with it. Seth Benson's kind of your classic linebacker, but they will send guys, and they do some stunts up front, some loops and stuff like that. But largely, they rarely deviate from a 4-man front. And they try to get as much pressure as they can with 4, because once you start throwing other guys out there, then that leaves you vulnerable to, with Ohio State with crossing routes will just eat you alive. And they'd rather have Campbell, for instance, being able to play more in the middle of the field. But, I think this is if Lucas Van Ness, who I think is going to be really good, can get some pressure, and a guy that's coming back that I think is going to be a very, very good player, and that's Y.A. Black. He is, 6'5", 310 in the middle. Broke his foot in the opener, and it looks like he's going to be back, and he's probably got as much upside as anybody on that defense. So I think, he'll probably look out of shape and maybe make a couple plays, but, he might be able to help out a little bit in that regard too.
Scott, I want to, before we let you go here, I want to take advantage of your expertise beyond Iowa. You're really plugged in on the Big Ten and the Big Ten West. This is Ohio State's second game against a Big Ten West team. That side of the division has been kind of crazy this year, to the point where like it looks like at a time it was like, oh, Nebraska might win this thing, even though they were terrible. What do you make of the West this year, and maybe more specifically, now that we've seen Illinois beat Minnesota, do you consider that the best team there, or who do you have your eye on in terms of who can get to Indianapolis?
I still like Purdue out of the West. They're tied with Illinois, and I like them because they've always played a different style than everybody else. They're an outlier that way, but I think they could do just so much more offensively, and I don't know that anybody else in the West can really keep pace with them. Maybe Nebraska, and they did a little bit the other day, but and I think largely everybody should root for that if you're wanting an interesting game in Indianapolis, because I don't think – I mean, Illinois beat Iowa 9-6, and it was exactly as much fun as it sounds. 3 field goals to 2. Iowa actually returned a fumble 82 yards, and under replay got reversed because the elbow just touched a piece of rubber filament on the ground. Otherwise, Iowa would have won. I think Illinois is a really tough team. I think they're physical. Brett Bielema has done an outstanding job there, but they're kind of like an 8-4 team. Okay, on the right day they could play with a Michigan. They do play them later, maybe Ohio State on a bad day, but I just don't see them being much of a threat to the upper echelon. The rest of the West, I mean, you guys saw Wisconsin. That's a shell of the Wisconsin teams even from a few years ago. Ohio State blew them out previously, but they're not as good defensively. They don't have that surge on the offensive line. Iowa, could at least most of the time, especially when they had tight ends in an offensive line, they could actually have a puncher's chance in some of these games, but not this year. Minnesota kind of looks like a fraud to me. I was expecting more out of them. You saw them up close last year in Minneapolis. Mo Ibrahim's a great running back, but Kenner Morgan, you want to talk about Spencer Petras being kind of inconsistent. Yeah. Holy cow. You got a guy who went like 23 of 26 and then 4 of 12 the other day against Illinois. I mean, God. So you have all these elements, and it's just it. I mean, we've seen a lot of disparity among the divisions. Usually at the upper echelon, in the middle and below, it's been really even. But I just don't know that. I mean, this year it's bad. I mean, at least most years Wisconsin would come in there and represent the West in decent fashion, or Iowa did once and then not so much once. So, that's why they're leaning towards scrapping divisions. It's just a matter of it's going to be next year or 2024 when USC and UCLA.
Yep, Scott, I was going to ask you that because for any of our listeners who don't know, if you need any coverage ever of Big Ten scheduling or how they do it, what it's going to look like, Scott at The Athletic is the guy for that. You didn't have to give away any scoops or anything that you're working on for those future schedules, but I was curious what you thought the likelihood of that being. No divisions, no conferences, whatever, starting next year. It seems more likely that they would wait till USC and UCLA were in place, but I do get the sense from some other people around the league that they'd like to do that effective immediately if they can and just get started on that process. But I would defer to you on that analysis.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's kind of a split, and it's kind of gone in waves. Like if you would have asked me this like 2 weeks ago, I thought, okay, they're going to do it next year, and it's just going to work then. But now, talking to a few other ADs and stuff, they're more like, let's just wait. Let's just keep this for one more year. The schedule part of it, they got a late start on everything because of the media rights deal and some of the other things. So they figured that some, not all, in fact, it's a minority that would prefer status quo, would just say, let's just wait one more year. And so I don't know if they're going to reach that. It looks like it might be the Big Ten championship game is when they're thinking that it's going to be the drop dead, whether they do it or not. Penn State's been the biggest force in trying to push for this. It has for a long time, and you wonder why. Well, they've been number 2 there. But one thing I kind of brought up this year, and I brought it up to Kevin Warren last week, was, look, if this was a one-league thing, you might have an Ohio State-Michigan rematch and knock one, maybe even both out of the playoff if it's split decision. This way, if Ohio State beats Michigan – and Ohio State blows out Purdue or Illinois or somebody just doesn't show up, which they shouldn't in Indianapolis. Then you got Ohio State, that's a number 2 seed, and Michigan, if it's a close game, could actually get in and be the second Big Ten team. Whereas if they were playing again, that wouldn't happen. So there's an advantage to actually having divisions like this year. But you also want to see a compelling championship game. But when you look in the future and it's a 12-team playoff, is that a good thing? Because you could knock out, like, let's say it's, I don't know, you got a 12-0 Ohio State, a 10-2 Michigan, a 10-2 Penn State, and it's a tiebreaker, or maybe even Wisconsin. It's a tiebreaker, and somebody goes to Indy, gets blown out. Maybe they would be a playoff team, and then now they're not. So those are all some things that they're thinking about, and they're trying to get to the best part of it. Plus, the media rights deal goes into effect next year, and it's kind of a weird one because CBS still has the SEC, so they only get 7 Big Ten games. And one other thing about it is, at least right now, especially with the Eastern Big Three and Michigan State too, to an extent, that they all get such high ratings against one another that if you decide, all right, we're going to scrap it and we're going to play this style, the schedule, what if you miss Michigan, Penn State? That's 10 million viewer game that they're running out of, or, in favor of, okay, well, Michigan gets to play for the jug against Minnesota instead. That just, that just doesn't compute. So they've got to work through some things. But my expectation is in 2024, which I'm really fascinated, is how are they going to align the schedules? Because everybody's got a rival, maybe 2 rivals. Iowa's the only one that really has 3 that it really wants to play. Some schools don't care. Penn State said it doesn't care, which is strange. I think the fans would say Ohio State, they should play every year. But
James Franklin is the one who doesn't like
that. Yeah, right.
We'll just
he'd rather just play once.
Let's just go ahead and make that clear. Who's pushing that one?
Yeah,
but that's what you're going to wind up with. I think Fox will say, who's your new rival, Ohio State? It's USC. You're playing every single year.
Yeah. And that's the interesting part of it is the easiest slotted schedule to make for the Big Ten in 24 and beyond is 3 permanents and then rotate the other 12 teams 2 years on, 2 years off, or every other year. That's what the SEC wants to do. That's what the ACC is sort of doing with 3-5-5 because they have 14 teams. And if you do it that way, and then if you're Ohio State, you automatically will play, let's say, Penn State and Michigan for sure, and then maybe you rotate that third one. Maybe it is USC for the first 4 years. Maybe it's Indiana because it's close, or Maryland. You want to get out to the East Coast,
baby. Got to protect the Yellow Buck.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Bring it back.
Wouldn't that be kind of cool though in Indy if you do play Illinois that the Yellow Buck is actually on the field next to the truck? They'll probably get
which one. Which one do you go grab first? They're both so.
Yeah, there are some trophies that really matter, and then there are the ones where it's like, oh yeah, where'd that thing go?
Bobby Carpenter told us, Scott, that he actually has one of the old Illibucks that was just like sitting in a closet.
Really?
They run out of space on it. Like there's not just one turtle floating around.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm like, well, you need to bring that to one of our shows. We've got to see that. But anyway.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, Iowa State and Iowa plays. They played for like the 4th different version of the Cy-Hawk Trophy. The first one, Iowa won it 15 years in a row, and it was just as bad as it sounds. And there was one year, one of the equipment managers told me that they got all the way to Ames and they started playing, and it was actually closer than they expected in the third quarter. Like, oh shit,
you're good.
Oh, we forgot it. Okay, we left it in Iowa City, and it's the worst looking trophy ever. And luckily for them, they won it. But I think that would just be glorious if someone forgets a trophy there. Never happened with Floyd or Rosedale, but the Illinois and Mike.
Ohio State has
pretty
no
certain
idea where it is.
Yeah, they don't know where that thing is. They have no idea where that trophy is. I guess we're going to have to cherish these moments we have left with the Big Ten East and the Big Ten West. Ohio State plays its second Big Ten West crossover on Saturday against Iowa at noon. We thank Scott Dochterman for joining us. Ryan Day will be hosting his lightning round later today. You can watch that live on the podcast, and we'll have bowl predictions for you on the Friday podcast daily. We'll talk to you then.